There were 5,309 juvenile serving sentences in the United States in 1995. This was the renaissance of the tough on crime movement, a time when the news was filled with stories of biologically violent juvenile prowlers, the so-called super predators, unleashing chaos on the once peaceful suburbs.
They're not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators.
Kids that once stole hubcaps now rape and murder. No fear of punishment. Experts call them super predators.
Madam President, we have predators on our streets.
It was the advent of the three strikes policy and the rise of mass incarceration. Politicians capitalized on fear and racial stereotypes, passing laws that prioritized punishment over rehabilitation and turning the court system into a weapon of imprisonment. Long since the Clinton years, the number of youth sentenced to prisons has dropped 70%. But while the incarceration rate has changed, the way the kids look has not. The crime rates themselves are roughly equal across racial groups. Black youth are disproportionately arrested and escalated at every stage of the court system, from prosecution to sentencing. Consider a white boy. According to the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, he has a roughly 1 in 1,000 chance of being arrested for a crime. Make him black, and that likelihood more than doubles. Then, in a process known as the carceral continuum, at each step he faces increasing severity of punishment compared to his white counterparts. The consequences are profound. In a 2021 study, researchers Magrum and Kennedy found that juvenile incarceration negatively impacts mental health, education, and employment, and increases the likelihood of adult incarceration nearly fourfold. These long-term harms affect black youth disproportionately due to their overrepresentation in the system. So what's the solution? Well, here's a very different story. South Africa, 1994. Apartheid, the country's decades-long period of racialized governance, had ended. Freedom fighter Nelson Mandela was released after 27 years of imprisonment and became president. The new government faced a practical problem: what to do with the 649 enforcers and policymakers who brutalized black South Africans for the past half-century. The oppression they inflicted was systematic, state-sanctioned, and deeply ingrained. It's hard to overstate the atrocities faced by black South Africans at the hands of whites. Millions of black South Africans were forcibly removed from their homes.
The population had been allocated 14% of the land, fragmented into 10 Bantustans.
Police officers killed protesters in the hundreds. The apartheid government systematically tortured and assassinated anti-apartheid activists. These acts and their perpetrators were those the new government had to reckon with. They had an ambitious plan, never tried on such a large scale and strikingly novel. Nothing. Not in the sense of an action, but in terms of amnesty. In a series of trials organized under the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, the perpetrators of these crimes were given immunity in exchange for their confessions. The aim was a practical one: to help the country move on as it surely must do. Even more striking than the novelty of the theory is that it worked. Years after the TRC was founded, most South Africans agreed that amnesty had helped them move forward. In 2000, political scientist James Gibson conducted a massive survey across South Africa's racial groups and found a broad consensus. The TRC process had fostered reconciliation. Truth led to reckoning. Reckoning led to healing. So what can the United States learn from this? How do we address black overrepresentation in the juvenile justice system? Well, that's the same as asking how we solve systemic racism. It comes down to biases, from officers to prosecutors to judges, and even to everyday citizens who call the police on black youth. The overrepresentation of black youth is not about crime rates. It's about systematic decision-making. No country has a perfect solution, but the TRC offers a compelling framework. Imagine a system where, after a youth is arrested, they're not sent down the carceral continuum. Instead, there's a system in place to pull them out. This isn't an entirely new idea. Just look to the related process of restorative justice. Criminologist John Braithwaite defines restorative justice as a process dedicated to rebuilding societal bonds through stakeholder input, including victims and offenders. This contrasts with the retributivist model, which isolates and alienates perpetrators from society. Amnesty as a proviso of the TRC allowed the apartheid-era crimes to come to light by encouraging an account of the perpetrator's actions without alienating them from society. In the juvenile justice system, it could serve a similar function, not as a free pass, but as a structured process for accountability and reintegration. Currently, restorative justice models exist in schools, small-scale diversion programs, and certain juvenile courts. But what if we built on these frameworks, integrating TRC's amnesty provision as a formal mechanism for juvenile justice reform? This would mean creating a system where youth who commit harm are required to fully disclose their actions in a mediated setting, apologize to the victim and engage in a dialogue process, complete community service directly benefiting those they harmed, and followed a restructured repayment plan if financial harm was caused. By embedding this within existing restorative justice programs, we can prevent youth from being permanently funneled into the carceral system while ensuring accountability. Science supports this approach. In 2012, Beatrice Luna demonstrated that adolescent brains are still developing, making juveniles more impulsive, but also making them more receptive to rehabilitation. Unlike punitive measures that entrench cycles of incarceration, an adapted amnesty framework within restorative justice leverages brain plasticity to reform behavior. Critics might ask, what about the rights of victims? What about their sense of justice? This is where restorative justice already has an answer. Unlike the TRC, where some victims felt sidelined, a juvenile amnesty provision must ensure direct victim participation. By requiring offenders to engage with those they harmed through dialogue, restitution, and service, we create a system that prioritizes healing for all parties involved. This idea is still in its early stages, a rough draft of what could be. But so was the TRC. Before it reshaped South Africa's future, the TRC was an experiment, a bold one. And maybe it's time the US took a similar leap.